Did Max Verstappen just say what we are all thinking right now? That Oscar Piastri may have sold his soul to McLaren and he won't get it back? Well, I wouldn't say it's untrue, but it's certainly a bold choice of words. This quote coming from Blick, not as gossip, but directly from Max's mouth, who lamented Oscar's decision to yield in Italy, with words that I've seen many F1 fans agree with. So if you're not familiar with exactly what Max said in this particular example, here it is for your consideration. Ahem. Definitely not. He's talking about McLaren's Papaya rules and whether or not he would subscribe to them. If you do that even once without a clear reason, you sell your soul. After that, the team can do whatever it wants with you, and don't forget, Piastri was right in the middle of the title fight. Now, when you're saying about a clear reason, you might be countering, so, well, there was a clear reason, there was a pit stop mistake. As Oscar said on the radio, he thought that pit stops mistakes were part of racing. So I think Max's take does stand in a way, and it is typical Max. It's brutal, but also very blunt. But it does get people to stop and think. And that was a trend I saw throughout 2025. Less people railing against Max just because it's Max, and more people just going, oh, actually. A better way to frame it, I reckon, is that maybe Oscar gave McLaren an inch and the team then took a foot. And I think Max is trying to paint Oscar's choice as some kind of betrayal of self-interest, a sign of weakness in his mind. It's designed to sting, and it makes a great headline, as you can probably tell. But it also does overstate what exactly happened. You could also consider it an example of Max deploying mind games, since Zach Brown has made it very clear that he is more than happy to employ mind games, even though politics is changing in Formula One and using pantomime theatrics is not really de rigueur anymore. Zach's gonna give it a go anyway, and Max is more than happy to oblige. So in a way, I disagree with Max, but in a way, I don't disagree. But what Max is getting at, though, is that once Oscar complied, the team learnt that they could ask and the next request would become less painful to make. But it also leaves room for nuance too, like Oscar weighing team harmony as well as long-term trust and contract politics, all of the stuff that every single driver has to deal with. And the fact that if he were to refuse such a call, it could have consequences beyond that one race. Because McLaren throughout the entire year was trying to be a modern, fair Formula One team to buck the trends of old, right at the same time where Lando was aiming to be a modern, fair champion. I must give them their credit here that at the Canadian Grand Prix, when we had that incident where the two drivers collided and Lando was forced into retirement, that could have easily become the flashpoint. That could have been the Spain 2016, but it didn't, and Lando's immediate apology over the radio diffused any potential fracas afterwards. But nevertheless, F1 is still a 200-mile-an-hour knife fight where adrenaline rules the day. So for McLaren, keeping both drivers feeling that they are being treated equally, that is really hard, even when the garage is actually quite a good place, which at the moment I think McLaren is a good place to be working at. Which does therefore lend Max a few points in that regard, because he's just describing a situation that we've seen time and time again in Formula One, funnily enough, at McLaren during the Ron Dennis days with Mika Hakkinen and David Coulthard. Yeah, both of those drivers were buddies for a very long time. They still work together to this very day. But Ron Dennis made no bones about the fact that Mika Hakkinen was very much his favourite, and DC just had to accept that. However, the part Max skips is why McLaren were in that situation in the first place, and why Oscar might have decided that one ugly Sunday is cheaper than potentially self-destructing his own standing within the team. Him also understanding far more than Max ever could that McLaren's team orders in 2025 were admittedly about identity. Throughout that entire season, McLaren were really trying to hammer home a very important point they've been trying to instill to us all since Oscar and Lando became teammates, that the team was equal, that they could muster two elite drivers, and that was certainly accelerated by the fact that Piastri came on leaps and bounds throughout his rookie year. They've been talking about that we will allow our drivers to race equally and fairly, and they have managed to prove their points a couple of times, only in isolation. With 2025 now wrapped up, McLaren can say, albeit with some pushback, that we did it. We didn't tell a driver to back off because they were numerically out of the contentions, although they did that in 2024 with Oscar, and Oscar complied in that situation too. But nevertheless, 2025, they did the double, and everyone was happy family, at least in front of the cameras. On social media, though, that's a different story. And when Monza happened and Piastri was asked to hand place back, McLaren jumped on that as being an example of their principles and fairness. not protecting Lando at all. Unfortunately for them trying to avert a soap opera became a soap opera anyway, because it left every non-McLaren fan with a sour taste in their mouths, and it just meant that we were all looking at every single race and watching McLaren very closely for any shenanigans to happen again. And that is not the kind of thing that team would exactly want, that kind of optic. Although they did admit, Zach and Andrea, that they weren't really caring what anyone else externally were thinking, so long as everyone internally was doing fine, that was the main thing. But considering that this is a team that really cares about its image, it's a really weird choice to make. And going back to Oscar really doing well in his rookie season, McLaren were also, if you think about it, in a bit of a bind, because Oscar proved to be annoyingly good right out of the gate, this really becoming a bone of contention at the Qatar Grand Prix weekend of 2023. Where, yes, Lando was congratulating Oscar on his sprint win, but he was also annoyed with the situation and annoyed with himself. And also, they had to do what they did in Monza, because if they didn't do it and the order was maintained, Norris' side of the garage would have felt aggrieved that Oscar was given preferential treatment or their man wasn't given fair dues. The person responsible for the slow stop would have felt absolutely terrible and then potentially been subjected to internal criticism or maybe harassment, and that would have been a poison biscuit that Andrea Stella would not have tolerated. Can you see what I mean here? That could have been the catalyst to start off a chain reaction of malcontent within that team. And I think McLaren may have to stick to it, as said by Toto, that if you claim to be a fair team, you are chained to that claim. You have to live by that slogan forever. And the slogan that the team chose to live by was Papaya rules. And as we have seen, that slogan has become an absolute laughingstock. So why is Max talking about something he really doesn't have much clue about, at least from an internal perspective? Well, he's talking about it from the sense that Red Bull never really fell into that trap, that you could describe how Red Bull have enacted as being ruthlessly competent. Well, I mean, save for a wobble with Christian Horner toward the end of it all. Unlike McLaren, Red Bull have a clear sporting structure and chain of command, a track record of backing their main guy hard once the direction is set. Even their strategy operation has been built around decisiveness, something of which McLaren will make use of now that Red Bull's Will Courtenay is about to take up his role earlier than expected at McLaren as their sporting director. And in an Autosport piece from 2024, Courtenay talks about running millions of simulated races across a race weekend to find strategies that keep coming out strong, because that has been a very major problem that McLaren has been dealing with for the last couple of years. Their ascent back up to the top has not been a very smooth one. They have made some very bad calls, they've looked vastly underprepared, and they've looked, quite frankly, amateurish, like monkeys running the zoo or something, throwing away points and prestige whilst trying to win a constructor's title. Hungary 2024 being an absolute example of it. Why Andrea Stella didn't just get on the radio and basically tell Lando point blank, hey, give up the place to Oscar or else, instead of just doing all of that tippy-toeing stuff. But yes, the separation in belief between Red Bull and McLaren might go some way as to explain why Max is so blunt with his wording in do not yield. At Red Bull, that's a pretty rational policy because it avoids the idea of existential career risk, and you won't have to worry about any potential repercussions, because look what happened between Checo and Max after the aggrievement of what happened in Monaco, where Verstappen lost out on pole, and then ultimately was served in Brazil, and Max stood by his reactions, not really caring about any repercussions, and naturally, there weren't any. But Oscar's environment is different. He's still in the phase where the team is partly evaluating him as a future number one. Should Lando either be tempted elsewhere or retire from F1 altogether, having stayed solely at McLaren? And what we've got so far from Oscar is that whilst his faith in the team has certainly been tested, it's not been damaged beyond repair yet. And as a result of this compliance and serving the team well, Zak Brown has actually been talking him up immensely, also saying that it's easy to forget he's only been in F1 for 3 seasons and that he has no doubt Oscar's star will rise in the years to come. And it's certainly a choice for Zak to say all of those nice things about Oscar. Saying absolutely nothing at all about Oscar would have also been a choice. Him being the CEO of McLaren, Zak carries a lot of weight in the F1 world, of course by design, as I talked about in my video the other day. It's not really my cup of tea, it's turning me off massively of McLaren, but the point is though, is that Zak is taking all of the stuff that Oscar's displayed throughout 2025 and rewarding him, as saying he's an integral part of McLaren, we absolutely love the guy, Oscar's real team player. So in the midst of all of this, maybe Oscar's been rewarded the right to say never again in 2026, that if McLaren were to pull a stunt just like that in Monza where it arguably compromised Oscar's title run, he could then point back to that, one of the biggest receipts in Formula One, and say, hey, wait a minute, I remember this game, you can't pull that stunt again, unless you are thinking about maybe changing your Papaya rules doctrine and your idea of being fair, and if that's the case, I may not really want to be a part of it. Oscar can do all of this quite rightly, legitimately, without looking like a diva. But at the same time, I may have to get the foam out for the fact that this could backfire in that, well, Oscar didn't really pout. Yes, he complained a bit on the radio, but then in the media pen, Oscar and Lando are treating this as the McLaren doctrine, as this was nothing out of the ordinary. But if this trend continues throughout 2026 and it just becomes the norm, then Max's warning may come true that instead of us talking about Oscar being a future world champion, many amongst the F1 world will be describing him, oh, he's the great number 2, isn't he? Whether or not Oscar intended that or not, and this does also lead into the Norris emotional bias train again, and I know that some of you may be sick to your stomach about it, but this might be a facet of McLaren they simply cannot shake. Because in my mind, as well as the minds of Martin Brundle, a former McLaren man, and former Academy rep Gabriel Bortoletto, McLaren might genuinely be trying to be fair, but they may still lean subconsciously, without trying, toward the guy who's carried the brand throughout the wilderness years, and even before that. In this sense, Norris has what I would describe as currency, in that he stuck through that team through thick and thin despite being tempted by organizations like Red Bull, and then Helmut Marko saying, ah yes, he would have made a perfect Red Bull driver. No, he ignored all of that and signed the contract very early on. That kind of loyalty was paid off in spades, and now he's at the center of McLaren's universe, now with a world title under his belt and the longest serving McLaren driver of all time. Oscar, he just cannot hold a candle to that. Not yet. So even though I am aggrieved by all of this and Oscar completely falling apart, what we have seen with McLaren is an example of human nature, albeit with a corporate bow on the top of it. Because Norris is a very important marketing ploy. He is able to appeal himself especially to very young McLaren and F1 fans. So in McLaren's mind, if they can hook them in young, then they've got them hooked for life. And as CEO, Zach's job right now is to protect the asset that is McLaren F1 at all costs, to make sure the good times keep on rolling, even if it may compromise previously held beliefs and loses a few fans along the way who may think that pure racing is no longer their main priority. And thanks to calm competence rather than fireworks and causing dramas and upset, Piastri has been able to achieve good standing within the organisation despite their personal endearment to Lando, and he's showing no signs of changing his tone, not bothered at all about being accused of being dull or, in the case of Max, a possible sellout. So even though I think Max is speaking some kind of truth, I just don't think Max is in a relatable place right now, because what he's saying is that he would have forced McLaren to pick a story, that he would have forced them to back him, or else he would have walked, or else he would have just simply phoned it in. And that is the kind of stuff champions say. I know what I'm doing here, so you better just listen to what I'm saying if you want the good times to keep on a-rolling. And not to mention that he probably reckons that the entire facade of McLaren being equal is ridiculous and they should just probably stop on getting on with the fact that, hey, if one driver is better than the other, then you roll with that driver. But to the driver's credit, both Oscar and Lando were able to keep it civil and cordial throughout the entire season. We really didn't see them getting that angry with one another, but there is still that very interesting point in the pre-Abu Dhabi Grand Prix press conference with all the 3 title contenders, where Lando said that, yeah, he is on good terms with Oscar, but it's in a very fragile place where one potential bust-up could easily see the house of cards completely collapse and things get incredibly sour. And if we did see a situation where Piastri felt like he has suffered the slings and arrows far too often than is comfortable, he could easily just leave, and it wouldn't surprise me if McLaren abandoned the Papaya rules equal terms and branding and instead just go for the conventional, we're going to back our main man Lando and we're going to bring somebody in to support him, which is why I think they brought in the likes of Leo Fornaroli, the F2 champion, to be their development and testing driver and potentially be their racer in waiting after Alex Dunn abandoned them. Trust me, this will happen one day. I don't see McLaren maintaining this for years and years and years. There will be a breaking point. because sustaining driver equality with two elite drivers, as we have seen, it's emotionally expensive for people within the organisation and us outside looking in. I mean, just look at what happened with Mercedes. Yeah, they were able to maintain it in 2013 because Mercedes were on the up and up and they were building something great. They managed, Nico and Lewis, to keep it mostly cordial throughout 2014, although we did see some cracks forming. And then by the time we got to 2015 and then 2016, the wheels started to come off that particular fairness and equality and good gravy wagon, Buemi style. So I bet you when Oscar leaves, we will not hear Papaya rules ever again, because there's no reason to keep them sacred, because, well, Piastri's gone, so therefore just go to a Norris-centric McLaren that starts to resemble Verstappen's Red Bull. Not because Norris is like Max, but because it's just simpler. And speaking of Red Bull, Will Courtenay's arrival as sporting director will see this trend form even faster. Because going back to that Autosport article, his instincts are really clear. Rotate driver roles to add depth and perspective, decide clearly at the track who has the final say, simulate relentlessly, and pre-plan reactions so you're not improvising under pressure. And I think all of that may also see their driver politics adopt a Red Bull-like DNA as well. Because if Will actually is able to have some influence as their sporting director, we might see a less emotionally charged McLaren, and instead we might see some of the emotional leaning toward Lando be moved back toward Oscar. So, in a way, this hiring from Red Bull could stand to actually help Piastri's case rather than hinder it. Yeah, they managed to pull off a major coup in bringing in somebody from a massively successful organization such as Red Bull, but then you've also got to consider that this is a major promotion for Will Courtenay, and if he doesn't have the authority that he's expecting, that relationship will not last long. But then at the same time, if McLaren continue to drift toward Norris, and then all of the facts and figures are painted and tailored to make it look like it was the objective thing to do, it'll lead to the situation when Oscar gave them an inch and then it became a foot, and it will eventually just become a mile. It really depends on whether or not Will is allowed to actually do his job properly, instead of having it being painted McLaren style. And that is what Max is trying to warn us all about in his own way. Because he's speaking from experience, such as the time he was with Daniel Ricciardo and the whole thing about what happened in 2018. Because even though he and Daniel get on famously as regular Joes, the racing pair eventually became fraught in a way all pairings become fraught when the team sees where the hockey puck is going. In this case, Max. I'm not going to get into the details about what was going through Ricciardo's head. That's been done to death many times here, and really we're talking about Max in this particular video. And I think the lesson that he learned is that you cannot have ambiguity within that team, because if you do have ambiguity, things start to not be fair anymore. You have to lay down the law. And that is exactly what he, his manager, and his father did at Red Bull to make things clear about how things were going to run. And that if you don't do that and you leave things incredibly vague, then you'll get drivers turning into politicians stating their case as to why they should be the favourite driver on that particular day, and that is going to lead to conflict. And yeah, Max was learning a lot of lessons in 2018, and that was one of them. And you can even bring in Jos Verstappen as some kind of familial example, as in maybe all of the lessons that Jos was trying to impart into his boy spoke from personal experience also, with his time as Schumacher's teammate over at Benetton. That being a perfect example of what happens when a team becomes a one-man band. Even when everything is professional, the second driver gets chewed up by the machinery of priorities, and who the whole weekend was built to serve. Yes, Jos did get a couple of podiums for his troubles, but he clearly did not gel with the order, and once he left, his career stalled. And that was a real big surprise for many people looking through Jos's junior career, thinking that he was a real major player in Formula 1 and could stand to win quite a few races. But then he was subjected to the Piranha Club and Flavio Briatore. And in the early 90s and onwards, Briatore carried a lot of political weight within Formula 1, which probably made Jos's time of it incredibly difficult to convince other major teams of taking him in, which is why he suffered in the midfield and the back marker teams and never really supped success ever again. So that could actually explain why Max's worldview is what it is. If you don't want your fate to be decided by others, you just grab that steering wheel at the first opportunity, such as when Daniel Ricciardo left Red Bull, and you never let go. And with Max saying this, I don't think he's trashing Oscar or anything. I think he really values the Australian. I think they get along famously. He just doesn't want this to happen to him, because he easily saw that as a possibility if the Daniel-Max relationship continued, and it may have actually led to a place where they wouldn't get on famously as regular Joes. Put simply, Max just doesn't want to see Oscar being exploited. And whilst I get what Max is saying, he's saying all of this atop a very gilded throne. All the while, Oscar is still in the process of building his throne, and he is part of a team that is publicly saying that thrones don't even exist. Max is speaking from a place where power has well and truly settled, and it's in his hands, whereas at McLaren, power is a very dangerous thing. It cannot settle, because if it does, towards one guy, then the entire experiment that they've been rolling with completely detonates, and they therefore have to just hold their hands up and say, okay, you're right, Papaya rules, oh, so much for all of that. Yeah, Norris is our guy because he stuck by us, unlike that turncoat Oscar. So even though I totally get what Max is saying, I think the main thing Oscar's trying to do here is trying to instill equality within that team for good, in simply not giving McLaren any ammunition in which to invoke total control toward one driver. And that might actually stand to benefit him, because this team is very, very keen on maintaining equality, at least in terms of the optics. And if they decide to go the other way, then Oscar can easily clap back with plenty of support. So you could easily say that Oscar right here is killing with kindness. Well, I mean, at least public kindness. Whether he winds up being McLaren's future depends on what happens next year. If 2026 reshuffles the grid and McLaren still find themselves fighting for titles again, albeit a little bit harder than in 2025, the pressure will force them to reveal what they really are, to see if 2025 was a fluke or a genuine sign of things to come that they can maintain it. If they can genuinely stay two-headed, Oscar's restraint last year becomes a weapon he can cash in on. If they tilt toward Norris more openly, if the competition is tight throughout and Lando waves his championship card in front of everyone, Oscar's restraint then becomes the origin story as to why he leaves. And I think what helps fuel the fire of Max's words is that right now, what people see when Max says something is absolute strength. A case of truth-telling, as in, you can't really argue with it, even though it is actually said quite strongly. And it's doubly helped by the fact that whenever people hear McLaren talking, there's a level of doubt or wobbliness about it, as in, do you actually mean that, or are you actually meaning something else? And it's all come at a point where Max is no longer seen as the villain, but a generational talent and a bastion of true racing, whereas McLaren themselves have gone from being the underdogs to the success story of 2023 to now being the villains. And it's also really funny because what Max is saying here is not only right, it's also quite self-serving, because he's actually benefited from that kind of politics and those situations within teams, so he is very experienced and qualified to actually talk about this. Even though I fully don't agree with it, I do understand what he is saying. So if you want to boil all of this down, what Max is warning us all about is giving up power and the consequences and ramifications. Whereas Oscar, he's busy trying to learn what exactly power is within McLaren and whether or not he can actually tap into it. Those are two very different things. But I bet you if Max were put in this situation, he wouldn't have given McLaren an inch. He would have given them an ultimatum. But what you should learn from all of this is that this video right here I'm sharing with you is something you really should go and watch if you liked what you heard. I'll see you over there.